The lights inside the grand ballroom were almost too bright to look at directly. They hung from the ceiling in massive, glittering rows, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. It was the kind of room where the air felt different, heavier maybe, because it was filled with so many people trying so hard to be important. The floor was polished marble that reflected the chandeliers, making the room feel twice as big as it actually was. There were no heavy wooden doors to block out the sound. Instead, the noise from the hallway spilled in, mixing with the soft jazz music playing from the speakers. Keanu Reeves stood near the edge of the crowd. He was wearing a tuxedo, but he didn't look like he was trying to be the star of the show. The jacket fit him well, but he wore it like a soldier wears a uniform, because he had to, not because he wanted the medals. His hair was messy in a way that looked intentional but also careless, as if he had just run his hands through it a dozen times. He held a glass of sparkling water in one hand, his thumb rubbing gently against the condensation on the glass. He was tired. It wasn't the kind of tired that sleep could fix. It was a deep kind of weariness that settled in his bones, the kind that comes from living a life full of both incredible highs and terrible lows. To everyone else in the room, he was the famous actor. He was the guy from the movies, the one everyone wanted to shake hands with. But looking at his face, if you really looked, you could see that his mind was somewhere else entirely. His eyes were soft, but they carried a sadness that he never quite managed to hide. It was a look that said he understood pain better than most people in this expensive room. Around him, the evening was in full swing. Men in expensive suits laughed loudly, slapping each other on the back. Women in colorful, flowing dresses moved from group to group, their jewelry catching the light every time they turned. They talked about stocks, vacations, and new projects. They held their wine glasses delicately, smiling with their mouths but not always with their eyes. The air smelled like expensive perfume, hairspray, and the faint scent of lilies that decorated every table. Keanu took a small sip of his water and tried to focus on the reason he was there. The event was a fundraiser for a children's hospital. That was the only reason he had agreed to come. He didn't enjoy these red carpet moments where everyone was looking at him, waiting for him to say something cool or funny. He much preferred the quiet moments, the times when he could just be without the weight of the world staring back at him. He scanned the room, looking at the banners that featured the hospital's logo. It was a good cause, a worthy cause. That thought helped him relax his shoulders, which had been tense since he arrived. People began to notice him. It started with a glance, then a whisper. A man nearby nudged his friend and pointed with his chin. The energy shifted slightly as the realization spread that the movie star was in the room. Keanu felt the change immediately. He was used to it, but it never really felt comfortable. He gave a polite, small nod to a couple who looked at him with wide eyes, but he didn't move toward them. He stayed near the wall, almost trying to blend into the white silk drapes that hung behind him. On the other side of the room, far away from where Keanu stood, a woman was watching him. She was older than many of the guests there. She wore a simple dress, dark blue, that didn't sparkle like the others. While the rest of the room seemed to be bubbling with excitement, she stood still. She looked like a statue that someone had placed in the wrong building. She wasn't holding a drink. She wasn't checking her phone. She was just watching. To anyone else, she might have looked like just another guest, perhaps a bit shy. But if you looked closely, you could see her hands shaking slightly by her sides. She gripped the fabric of her dress so tightly her knuckles were turning white. Her eyes were fixed on Keanu, but they weren't looking at him with excitement or admiration. There was a fire in her eyes, but it was a cold fire. It was the kind of look that comes from a person who has been carrying a heavy load for too long and is finally about to break. She saw the way he stood, the way he smiled politely at strangers, the way he seemed to be hiding his true self behind a mask of calmness, and it made her angry. It made her chest hurt with a sharp, hot pain. To her, he wasn't a person. He was a symbol. He was a reminder of everything she had lost. The music seemed to fade away for her, the chatter of the rich people turning into a dull buzz in her ears. All she could see was him. Keanu shifted his weight. He adjusted his cufflink, a small, nervous habit. He felt a headache starting to form right behind his eyes. He thought about stepping out onto the balcony to get some fresh air to escape the heat and the noise. But he knew that if he stepped out, people would follow. They always did. so he stayed put. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of the lilies and the perfume, trying to ground himself in the present moment. A waiter walked by with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. Keanu shook his head when the waiter offered him one. He wasn't hungry. His stomach felt tight. He watched a young photographer near the front of the room adjusting a massive camera on a tripod. The flash went off with a blinding white pop, making Keanu blink. He rubbed his face with his free hand, letting out a breath he felt like he'd been holding all night. "He looks lonely," a woman whispered nearby to her date. "He's famous," the date replied, shrugging. "That's the price of admission." Keanu didn't hear them, but he felt the truth of the words without knowing they were spoken. He knew the price of fame. He had paid it many times over the years. But tonight, it felt heavier than usual. Maybe because he was getting older, or maybe because the contrast between this lavish party and the sick children he was there to help was so stark. It felt strange to be eating tiny fancy foods and drinking champagne when there was so much suffering in the world. He looked up, scanning the crowd again, almost as if his intuition was telling him to pay attention. His eyes swept over the faces, laughing, talking, drinking, and then for a split second they locked onto the woman in the dark blue dress. She was still staring at him. The intensity of her gaze was piercing. Most people looked at him with a smile, or with curiosity, or with hunger for a piece of his fame. But she looked at him like she was looking through him. It gave him a chill. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, though the room was warm. He couldn't explain it, but he felt a sudden, strange sense of foreboding. It was like the calm before a storm, that moment when the birds stop singing and the wind goes still. The woman took a step forward, then another. She moved differently than the other guests. They glided, she marched. Her path was straight as an arrow, cutting through the clusters of people who were busy talking about money and movies. She didn't stop to say hello to anyone. She didn't smile, she just kept her eyes locked on him, her face pale, her jaw set tight. Keanu watched her come. He didn't know who she was. He thought for a moment that she was just a fan who wanted to say hello, perhaps someone who was a bit nervous or starstruck. He prepared himself to be polite. He prepared the soft smile he used for these moments. He prepared to shake her hand and ask her name. He had no idea that his life was about to intersect with hers in a way that would leave the entire room breathless. He just stood there waiting, the glass of water sweating in his hand, as the distance between them closed. One slow step at a time. The woman moved through the crowd like a ship cutting through a dark ocean, leaving small ripples of confusion in her wake. She did not glide the way the other women did. She marched. Her heels clicked against the hard floor with a sharp, rhythmic sound that seemed to match the beating of her own heart. To the people she passed, she was just a blur of dark blue fabric, a ghost moving too fast for such a slow, lazy evening. Her chest felt tight, like a heavy band was squeezing the air out of her lungs. She wasn't really seeing the room anymore. The lights, the golden glow, the shiny dresses, it all blurred together into a messy painting of colors. The only thing that was clear to her was him, Keanu. He stood there, calm and quiet, looking like a person who had all the time in the world. And that look made the fire inside her burn hotter. It wasn't fair. That was the thought spinning around in her head, over and over again. It wasn't fair that he was standing there, surrounded by luxury, while her world felt like it had been turned upside down. She had given money to be here. She had written a check that hurt her bank account, hoping that maybe, just maybe, giving to this hospital would make some sense of the pain she was carrying. She thought doing good would make the hole in her heart feel smaller, but it didn't. Seeing him, seeing this display of wealth and happiness, only made the hole feel bigger. She bumped into a man holding a plate of tiny sandwiches. The man grunted, almost dropping his food. "Watch it," he muttered, looking annoyed. She didn't even apologize. She didn't even look at him. She just kept her eyes forward, locked on her target. Her hands were shaking so badly now that she had to clench them into fists to hide it. Her fingernails dug into her palms, the sharp pain grounding her, keeping her from floating away into her own grief. She felt like she was outside of her own body, watching herself walk toward a cliff. Keanu saw her coming closer. He could feel the change in the air around him. The happy, buzzing noise of the party seemed to get quieter as she approached. He noticed that she wasn't smiling. Most people, when they walk up to a celebrity, have a grin on their face. They are excited, they are happy. This woman looked like she was in pain. Her face was pale, her lips pressed together into a thin, hard line. Her eyes were wide and wet, shining with tears that she was refusing to let fall. He felt a knot form in his stomach. He had a strange feeling, an instinct that something wasn't right. But he pushed it down. He told himself he was just overthinking. He told himself to be kind. Maybe she was just a fan who was overcome with emotion. Maybe she had a story she needed to tell. He knew what it was like to carry heavy things. He knew that sometimes just looking at someone you admire can make you lose control of your feelings. So he stood his ground. He didn't step back. He straightened his jacket and prepared himself to listen. The woman was only a few feet away now. She could see the details of his face. She saw the lines around his eyes, the gentle way he held himself. He looked kind. He looked like a person who would listen, and that made her even angrier. Why did he have to look kind? Why did he have to be the symbol of this charity? It felt like a cruel joke. She felt a scream building up in her throat, but she swallowed it down. It turned into a hot, sharp pressure behind her eyes. She remembered the silence of her own home. She remembered the empty chair at the kitchen table. The memories hit her like a physical force, almost knocking her off balance. She looked at Keanu and she didn't see an actor. She saw life. She saw a man who was alive and breathing and standing, while someone she loved was gone. The contrast was too much. The injustice of it was too much. The rational part of her brain, the part that knew this wasn't his fault, that part shut down. All that was left was the raw, bleeding need to let it out. She needed to break something. She needed to break the calmness of this night. Keanu took a small step toward her, a gesture of welcome. He opened his mouth to speak, probably to say hello or to ask if she was okay. His voice was soft when it finally came out. "Hi there," he said gently. "Are you all right?" His voice was so calm, so steady. It was the last straw. It was the match dropped into a pool of gasoline. The kindness in his tone felt like an insult to her stormy, chaotic feelings. It felt like he was pitying her. The woman didn't say a word. She couldn't have spoken even if she wanted to. Her throat was closed up tight. She just kept walking, closing the last few inches of distance between them. The people standing nearby stopped talking. They sensed the tension. They saw the look on her face and went quiet. A waiter froze, a towel draped over his arm. The music seemed to drift into the background, becoming unimportant. Keanu looked at her, confusion flickering across his face. He saw her hand pull away from her side. He saw the tension in her arm. His brain registered that something was wrong, that this wasn't a normal greeting, but it was too late to move. It all happened in slow motion and fast forward at the same time. She didn't think about it. If she had thought about it, she might have stopped. She just let her body take over. Years of sadness, months of holding it together, weeks of pretending to be normal, it all exploded in that single moment. Her arms swung up from her side, propelled by a force she didn't know she had. Her palm was open, fingers stiff. The sound hadn't happened yet. The world was suspended in that one split second before impact. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a tiny moment their worlds collided. His world of quiet patience and her world of loud, screaming grief. She saw the realization dawn in his eyes. She saw him flinch not out of fear but out of surprise. Then her hand connected with his cheek. It wasn't a gentle tap. It was a hard, sharp blow. The force of it turned his head to the side. The dark blue fabric of her sleeve fluttered in the air. The physical contact sent a shockwave through the air, instantly changing the atmosphere of the entire ballroom. The noise of the party, the clinking glasses, the soft jazz. It all seemed to vanish in an instant, replaced by the sudden, violent reality of what had just occurred. She stood there, her arms still raised, her chest heaving like she had just run a marathon. Her hands stung from the impact, but she barely felt it. She just stared at him, her eyes wild, waiting for the world to catch up to what she had done. The silence that followed was not the peaceful silence of a library. It was a heavy, shocked silence that pressed down on everyone's ears. The spell of the gala was broken. The night was no longer about champagne and charity. It was about this woman, and this man, and the loud sound that had just shattered the peace. The sound seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. It was a sharp, cracking noise, like a branch snapping in a quiet forest. For a second, nobody moved. The music from the speakers kept playing, a soft jazz tune that suddenly felt completely wrong, like a happy song at a funeral. The man with the tiny sandwiches stopped chewing. The woman with the expensive perfume stopped laughing mid-sentence. The entire ballroom was frozen in a strange, suspended animation. Keanu's head had turned to the side with the force of the blow. His hair, usually messy and free, was pushed away from his forehead. A red mark began to bloom on his cheek, standing out brightly against his pale skin. He didn't move. He didn't bring his hands up to rub his face. He didn't shout or step backward. He just stood there looking down at the floor, processing what had just happened. It was as if his body was waiting for his mind to catch up. The woman who had hit him stood panting, her chest rising and falling rapidly. The anger that had powered her across the room had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. In its place was a terrifying look of confusion. She looked at her own hand as if it belonged to someone else, as if it were a foreign object she had never seen before. Her fingers were trembling violently, shaking so hard that she had to clasp them together against her chest. Slowly, Keanu turned his face back toward her. He didn't look angry. That was the most surprising thing. He didn't look like a man who wanted to fight back. He didn't look like a celebrity who was insulted. His eyes were wide, filled with a soft, deep concern. He looked at her, really looked at her, and he didn't see an attacker. He saw a human being who was falling apart. "Why?" he asked quietly. His voice wasn't loud, but in the silent room it carried. The woman opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The reality of the moment crashed down on her. She was in a room filled with hundreds of people. Cameras were flashing from the corners. She had just struck a famous movie star in front of the world. The panic rose in her throat, choking her. The tears that had been burning in her eyes finally spilled over, running hot tracks down her cheeks. I don't," she stammered, her voice cracking. She took a step back, her heel catching on the hem of her dress. She stumbled slightly, looking around wildly. The room was staring at her, all those eyes judging her, watching her shame. It felt like the walls were closing in. The spell of silence broke. "Hey!" a deep voice boomed from the side. It was one of the security guards, a large man with a stern face. He had seen the movement and was pushing his way through the frozen guests. "Get back!" he shouted, elbowing past a waiter. Another guard joined him, rushing toward the woman with hands raised, ready to grab her. People in the crowd began to gasp. A few women covered their mouths with their hands. The whispers started, a low, buzzing noise like a hive of angry bees. "Did she just hit him? Who is that woman? Someone stop her!" The guards were closing in fast. The woman saw them coming and shrunk into herself. She raised her hands over her head, cowering like a frightened animal. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for them to tackle her, to drag her away, to hurt her. She knew she deserved it. She felt the weight of her own violence crushing her. She just wanted to disappear. "Stop!" The word wasn't shouted, it wasn't aggressive, but it was firm. The guards slowed down, they looked toward the voice. It was Keanu. He had stepped forward, placing himself slightly between the woman and the rushing guards. He held up one hand, palm out, in a gesture that meant halt. His other hand gently rubbed his cheek, where the red mark was now darkening. "Stop," he said again, more softly this time. "It's okay. Just stop." The guards looked confused. They looked at the red mark on his face and then back at the crying woman. Their job was to protect him, to remove threats. But he was telling them to stand down. The head guard hesitated, his hands hovering in the air, looking for permission to intervene. Keanu shook his head slightly, a small, barely there movement. The guard stepped back, his expression changing from aggression to caution, but he stayed close, watching like a hawk. The room was holding its breath again. This wasn't how these things went. Usually when a fan went crazy, security pounced and the celebrity was whisked away to safety. But Keanu wasn't moving away. He was stepping closer. The woman was sobbing now, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. She couldn't catch her breath. She was hyperventilating, gasping for air between cries. She looked up, her vision blurred by tears, and saw him standing there. She expected him to yell. She expected him to look at her with hate. Instead, his face was calm, almost eerily calm. He looked at her with a gaze that felt like it could see right through her skin, right down to her broken heart. "Please," she whispered, her voice so small it was almost drowned out by her sobbing. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." She wasn't just sorry about the slap, she was sorry about everything. She was sorry for her loss, sorry for her pain, sorry for being a mess in this beautiful room. She felt exposed, like her skin had been peeled off and everyone could see the raw nerves underneath. Keanu took another step. The distance between them was almost gone. He ignored the flashing cameras. He ignored the murmurs of the crowd. He focused entirely on her. He saw that she wasn't a threat. She was a drowning person who had just tried to pull someone else under with her, not out of malice, but out of desperation. "Breathe," he said gently. He didn't say it like an order. He said it like a suggestion, a lifeline thrown to a person lost at sea. "Just breathe." The woman tried to take a breath, but it hitched in her throat, turning into another ragged sob. She looked at him with pleading eyes, silently begging him to understand, even though she couldn't explain. The air in the room felt thick, charged with electricity. The tension was so high you could almost taste it. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Would the guards listen to him? Would the woman collapse? Would he finally get angry? Keanu reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away if she wanted to. He didn't reach for her shoulder or her arm in a way that might feel threatening. He reached for her hand, the one that had struck him just moments ago. Her hand was still hovering in the air, shaking. He took it gently. His grip was warm and firm, but not hard. He lowered her hand slowly, guiding it down away from her face. He didn't flinch when he touched her. He didn't pull away. He just held her hand, grounding her, letting her know that she was here in this room and that she wasn't alone in her chaos. The sight was shocking to the onlookers. The famous actor, holding the hand of the woman who had assaulted him, treating her with a tenderness that most people reserve for their closest friends. The anger in the room began to dissipate, replaced by a confused kind of awe. No one understood what was happening, but they could feel the gravity of it. They were witnessing a moment of grace in a place that usually only had style. The skin on his cheek burned with a sharp, stinging heat. It was a throbbing sensation that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. Any normal person would have been angry. Anyone else would have yelled, pushed her away, or demanded that the guards drag her out. It was the natural reaction to being hit. It was the instinct to protect oneself. But Keanu didn't feel anger. As he looked at the woman crumbling in front of him, the anger just wasn't there. He felt a heavy sadness instead. The physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional pain he saw radiating from her. He squeezed her hand gently, feeling her cold fingers trembling in his warm grip. He was anchoring her, keeping her from floating away into her panic. "Look at me," he whispered. He didn't speak loudly, he didn't need to. The silence in the room was so thick that a whisper sounded like a shout. The woman tried to look away, ashamed. She couldn't bear to look into the eyes of the man she had just struck. But his gaze was steady. It wasn't demanding. It was patient. He waited just like he had waited earlier in the night for the speeches to end. He waited until she finally lifted her head and met his eyes. When she looked at him, she didn't see a movie star. She saw a man who understood the dark. She saw eyes that had seen loss and had not turned away from it. That look broke her completely. Her knees gave way slightly and she slumped forward. Keanu didn't pull back. He stepped in, taking her weight, supporting her so she didn't fall to the hard floor. "It's all right," he said softly. "Let it out." The crowd around them was confused. They watched with a mix of horror and fascination. People whispered behind their hands, craning their necks to see over the tall floral arrangements. They didn't understand why he wasn't fighting back. They didn't understand why he was comforting her. They were used to a world where if you hit someone, they hit you back harder. They were used to grudges and lawsuits and public fights. This act of quiet forgiveness was something they didn't know how to process. The head security guard took a half step forward, his face red with indignation. He looked at the red mark on Keanu's face and felt a protective instinct flare up. "Sir," he said, his voice low and urgent, "we need to remove her. She's a danger." Keanu glanced at the guard for just a second. It was a quick look, but it was enough to make the man stop. Keanu didn't say anything. He just gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He turned his attention back to the woman. He wasn't going to let them take her. He knew that dragging her away wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't heal her, and it wouldn't heal the situation. He was choosing peace over pride. He was choosing connection over punishment. The woman was sobbing openly now, great ugly gasps that echoed in the quiet room. She was saying sorry over and over again, the words tumbling out in a messy stream. "I didn't mean to. I'm so sorry, I just miss him." I just miss him so much, she cried, the words finally spilling out. Keanu listened. He heard the words miss him. He realized she was talking about a son, or a husband, or someone she had loved deeply. The anger she had hit him with wasn't really for him. It was for the universe, for the bad luck, for the empty space at her dinner table. She had just happened to be standing in front of him when the dam broke. He nodded slowly. He didn't offer empty cliches. He didn't say it gets better or he's in a better place. He knew that those words didn't help. They just made the pain feel sharper. Instead, he just stood there and let her feel his presence. He let her know that she wasn't alone in her grief. He squeezed her hand again, a silent reminder that he was there, that he was solid, that he wasn't going anywhere. The tension in the room began to shift. It was no longer the electric tension of a fight. It was becoming a sacred atmosphere. People stopped whispering. They stopped looking at their phones. They started to actually see the human drama playing out in front of them. They saw a man who had every reason to be hateful, choosing to be kind. It was a powerful thing to witness. It made them feel small, and it made them feel awe. Keanu ignored the flashes of the cameras. He knew there would be photos tomorrow. He knew the headlines would scream about the incident. But he didn't care about headlines. He cared about the human being in front of him. He cared about the tears soaking the collar of his tuxedo. He felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. This was real. This wasn't a movie script written by someone trying to be dramatic. This was the messy, painful, beautiful reality of life. "You're hurting," he said to her. It was a statement, not a question. "I know," he knew. He knew what it was like to lose people you love. He knew what it was like to walk through a world that kept spinning when your own world had stopped. He knew the feeling of being surrounded by people, but feeling completely alone. That shared pain was a bridge between them. It was the reason he wasn't angry. How could he be angry at a reflection of his own suffering? The woman looked up at him, her eyes swollen and red. She searched his face for any sign of mockery or anger. She found none. She saw only a deep, quiet empathy. It disarmed her. The fight went out of her completely. She leaned against him, exhausted, like a child who has cried themselves out and just needs to be held. The red mark on his cheek was still vivid, a testament to the violence that had happened just moments ago. But his expression was soft. His jaw was relaxed. He looked like a man who had found a moment of grace in a chaotic world. He stood tall, shielding her from the hundreds of eyes that were watching them. In that moment, he created a small circle of safety for her in the middle of that hostile, confusing room. He shifted his feet, planting them firmly on the marble floor. He wasn't going to move until she was ready. He wasn't going to let the crowd dictate how this moment ended. He was going to stand his ground, not against her, but with her. The music from the speakers had stopped completely at some point, or perhaps it just seemed that way. The only sounds were the woman's ragged breathing and the low murmur of the guards shifting their weight. It felt like the whole world had narrowed down to this one spot, this one interaction between two strangers who had collided in the most dramatic way possible. Keanu let go of her hands slowly and brought both hands up to her shoulders. He held her gently, not trapping her, just steadying her. He looked her in the eyes one more time, making sure she was really there, really seeing him. "It's okay," he repeated, his voice low and reassuring. "You're not alone." Then, as the room watched in stunned silence, he did the one thing no one expected. He didn't step back to call for help. He didn't signal for the doctor. He simply pulled her forward, into his arms, wrapping her in a hug that seemed to block out the rest of the world. For a long moment, the hug was the only thing that existed in the world. It wasn't a quick, polite hug that strangers share. It was a firm, steady embrace, the kind you give someone who is holding on by a thread. Keanu wrapped his arms around the woman, pulling her close. He didn't care that her tears were soaking the shoulder of his expensive jacket. He didn't care that his cheek was throbbing with a dull ache where she had hit him. He just held her, letting her collapse against his chest. To the woman, the feeling was overwhelming. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't holding the weight of the world up by herself. She felt the strength in his arms, and instead of feeling threatened, she felt safe. She buried her face in his shoulder, the smell of his cologne and the fabric of his suit grounding her. The sobs that had racked her body began to slow down, turning into quieter, hitching breaths. The scream inside her head had finally stopped. The room was dead silent. It was a silence so deep that it felt heavy. People stood with their drinks halfway to their lips, forgotten. The photographers had lowered their cameras, looking unsure of whether they should take a picture or look away. It felt like we were watching something too private, too raw to be witnessed by a crowd. The violence of a few minutes ago had been shocking, but this quiet act of forgiveness was shaking them even more. The security guards stood nearby, looking uncomfortable. They shifted their weight from foot to foot, unsure of what to do. Their training told them to neutralize threats, but the man they were protecting had neutralized the threat with kindness. They looked at each other, then back at Keanu. Seeing that he was calm, they relaxed their stance, turning from bodyguards into bystanders. Keanu leaned his head down close to the woman's ear. He didn't say anything loud, he didn't preach, he just whispered a few words meant only for her. "You are not alone," he said softly. "It's okay to hurt. Just breathe." The words were simple, but they hit her like a healing balm. She nodded against his shoulder, a small, weak movement. She squeezed his arm, not to hurt him this time, but to hold on, to say thank you without speaking. She knew she didn't deserve his kindness, not after what she had done, but he was giving it to her anyway. That was the part that broke her heart and fixed it all at the same time. Slowly, he pulled back from the hug, but he didn't let go of her arms. He held her at arm's length, looking her in the eyes again. He smiled just a little bit. It was a sad smile, but it was genuine. It was a smile that said he understood the dark places she had been. "Are you okay now?" he asked gently. The woman wiped her face with the back of her hand, trying to regain some dignity. She looked around the room, suddenly remembering where she was. She saw the hundreds of eyes staring at her. Her face flushed hot with embarrassment. She looked back at Keanu, her eyes wide with apology. She opened her mouth to apologize again, to explain, to say anything to make up for the slap. Keanu shook his head slightly, stopping her. "Don't worry about me," he said. He let go of one of her arms and gently touched his own cheek, wincing just a little. "I'll survive." "Worry about yourself." A woman in a staff uniform, someone who worked for the charity event, cautiously stepped forward. She looked at Keanu, asking for permission with her eyes. Keanu nodded at her. He gently guided the woman toward the staff member. "Take her to get some water," Keanu told the staff member, his voice firm but kind. "Let her sit down for a while. Make sure nobody bothers her." The staff member nodded, looking impressed and relieved. She put a hand on the woman's back to guide her away. The woman looked back at Keanu one last time as she was led away. She looked like she wanted to say a million things, but she couldn't. She just mouthed the words, "Thank you," before disappearing into the crowd toward a quieter exit. Once she was gone, the silence in the room shattered. The noise came rushing back like a tidal wave. But it wasn't the same noise as before. The air had changed. People weren't gossiping about money or movies anymore. They were talking about what they had just seen. A hum of amazement rippled through the ballroom. Keanu stood alone again. He let out a long, slow breath, the kind you let out when you've been holding it in for too long. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a clean white handkerchief, and dabbed at his forehead. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him feeling tired. He turned his back to the main crowd for a moment, looking at the white silk drapes on the wall, just needing a second to compose himself. A man in a very expensive suit, someone who looked important, came up to him. The man was sputtering, clearly angry about the disruption to his event. "Mr. Reeves," the man started, his voice high and annoyed. "I cannot apologize enough. That was unacceptable. We are calling the police, of course. We will press charges for the assault." Keanu turned around. The annoyance in the event organizer's face melted away when he saw Keanu's expression. Keanu wasn't angry. He looked tired, but his eyes were calm. "No police," Keanu said quietly. He cut the man off immediately. "No charges." The organizer blinked, confused. "But she hit you in front of everyone." "It's an assault. She was hurting," Keanu said simply. He folded the handkerchief and put it back in his pocket. "She wasn't attacking me. She was reacting to pain. Everyone handles pain differently. She just ran out of ways to carry it." The organizer stood there, mouth slightly open. He looked like he had never heard of such a thing in his world of contracts and lawsuits. "But what do we tell the press?" Keanu shrugged, a small, humble gesture. "Tell them the truth. Or tell them nothing. It doesn't matter." He adjusted his jacket, smoothing out the wrinkles where the woman had grabbed him. His cheek still hurt, a throbbing reminder of the chaos, but his heart felt lighter. It felt good to have absorbed that hit, to have taken that anger and turned it into something else. It felt like the only way to truly honor the suffering he had seen in his own life. "I'm going to step out for some air," Keanu told the man. "Don't make a scene. Let her go home." The organizer just nodded, looking at Keanu with a new kind of respect. Keanu turned and began to walk toward the edge of the room. As he moved, the crowd parted for him. Before, they had looked at him as a celebrity, as a figure to be admired from afar. Now they looked at him with a quiet reverence. They saw the red mark on his face, but they also saw the grace in his stride. They didn't ask for selfies. They didn't reach out to touch him. They just watched him pass, silence falling over the groups he walked by. He found a quiet corner near the tall windows, away from the center of the party. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes for a second. He thought about the woman. He hoped she would get the help she needed. He hoped she would find some peace. He realized that by hitting him, she had given him a gift, too. She had reminded him that everyone is fighting a battle that no one else can see. A waiter walked by and quietly offered him a fresh glass of water. Keanu took it with a nod of thanks. He took a sip, feeling the cool liquid soothe his dry throat. He looked out at the room one last time. The party was starting up again. The music was playing, people were laughing, and the glasses were clinking. The surface of the event was the same. But underneath, everything had changed. Keanu touched his cheek gently again. It would probably bruise. Tomorrow, he might see a purple mark on his face in the mirror. But every time he looked at it, he knew he wouldn't remember the pain. He would remember the silence of the room and the feeling of a broken soul finding a moment of rest in his arms. And he knew that was worth more than all the applause in the world. He took a deep breath, finished his water, and stood up straighter, ready to face the world again.